So it's been 3 years since the launch of the M2 MacBook Air, and the prices have dropped significantly, making it a potential buy for you guys out there looking for a new laptop in 2025. And in this video today, we're going to be taking a look at my personal M2 MacBook Air that I've been using for those 3 years. Taking a look at the pre-owned value of a base model M2 Air, it goes for around $500 to $600, while the higher spec models range around $1,000. Comparing that to the newly announced M4 MacBook Air, the base model of the new ones go for around $1,000 already. So that begs the question, is the M2 MacBook Air a bargain right now, or should you just settle for the latest and greatest? So this is the 13-inch M2 MacBook Air launched in 2022. It has an 8-core M2 chip, which has 4 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores. And I did go ahead and upgrade the GPU to a 10-core rather than the standard 8. I opted for 16 gigabytes of RAM, the maximum is 24, and a 1TB SSD, which the max being 2 terabytes. Now another thing to note is that if you are opting for the base model, the SSD is a single chip, whereas anything that is over 500 gigabytes uses 2 chips, being a little bit more efficient and faster. And with the release of Apple Intelligence, with this being an Apple Silicon MacBook, yes, it will have support for that. So with that being said, the specs of my M2 Air isn't necessarily a base model, nor is it the fully spec'd out model. So I wanna say this is somewhere in the middle ground as a mid-tier MacBook Air. Now I wanna talk about the overall condition after using this for 3 years. I've traveled with it, I've thrown it in my bag, in my car, pretty much everywhere that I go. And overall, it's in pretty good shape. It does have a couple of minor scratches and nicks, and it does have a small little baby crack on the bezel. Now that can be easily fixed with a razor blade and a heat gun, and the part itself is just like 15-20 bucks on Amazon. But overall, I gotta say, it's in pretty good physical shape considering that it's been going through a beating for many years. And this is something that you would kind of expect from a pre-owned model if you were to buy one now. You know, it's gonna have a little bit of age to it, but not terrible. However, the battery health on here is only 84%. It does classify it as normal and a 297 cycle count. Apple does recommend doing a battery replacement after it hits around 80% of health left, so it is kind of cutting close to that range. And even though the battery has degraded over the years, I don't really notice a big difference. Additionally, I did make some small modifications to this MacBook in order to improve the thermal capacity, and that's pretty much an issue that all MacBook Airs kind of suffer with because it is a fanless design. That's how Apple is able to accomplish this very slim profile. And so when there are no fans and everything is passive, heat really builds up and it can potentially cause some thermal throttling, slowing down the machine. So what I've done is I've actually taken apart the rear panel and installed some thermal pads to distribute the heat a little bit better. Mind you, this process could be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. You can cause damage to the MacBook, or it can actually void your warranty. And I gotta say, it actually made quite a big difference, which I'll get to in just a bit. So let's talk about how the M2 MacBook Air performs. Now, primarily I use this for productivity, emails, web browsing, and occasionally some photo and video editing. Now, when it comes to my overall usage with it, it's very fast. It's super quick, very snappy. It starts up instantly. And I'm someone who likes to open like 20 tabs at once, different programs all at once. And I just let a lot of stuff run in the background. And with these 16 gigabytes of RAM in here, it definitely helps with the multitasking. I don't notice it slowing down, switching between applications. Everything just works perfectly. But when it comes to editing, that's where things get a little bit tricky. So when it comes to Photoshop or Lightroom for photo editing, everything is completely smooth, no issues with that. But when I hop into Premiere Pro for my video editing, anything that is 4K or less in my timeline works pretty okay. But if you start adding effects or if you're working with larger files, then it could definitely start lagging and slowing down. Now, I did actually try editing 8K footage on here, and for the most part, it seems okay when you're just doing some basic cuts. But if you start adding any sort of color grade and effects, the whole entire thing just gets really laggy. And most of it isn't actually because of the M2 chip not being powerful enough. It's more to do with the heat. And when it gets hot, the performance actually starts to slow down because that's a way of the computer kind of trying to save itself. But that's gonna translate to more lag, the computer freezing up, things slowing down. And that kind of brings me back to the whole thermal mod that I talked about earlier. By putting some thermal pads in here, it allows the heat to kind of distribute across the whole entire bottom tray, allowing me to do more intensive tasks for a longer duration. But at the end of the day, it'll still cut back and thermal throttle. Before the modification, I noticed I can edit videos for maybe 15-20 minutes before it starts lagging. But with the modification, I can hit around 30 minutes to 40 minutes before it starts slowing down. Now I know you might say, why are you using a MacBook Air for editing videos. That's what the Pro is designed for, and you're right. The other thing about this MacBook is that this is not my primary editing machine. I do have a custom-built PC to do most of my heavy workloads. This is just something I take with me on the go due to its portability. I can do some quick edits if I have a client revision or something that I have to work on. But other than that, I don't really use this all too much for editing, but it is capable of doing so if it's not too heavy. So if you're looking into getting a M2 MacBook Air, you gotta ask yourself what it is that you're trying to accomplish. If you're someone just looking to get something to use for school, to process documents and whatnot, this is more than enough for you. Even if you get the base model M2 Air, that can be sufficient for all of your productivity needs. But if you are someone who does a lot of multitasking, upgrading some of the components like getting 16 gigabytes of RAM, maybe 24 gigabytes of RAM, potentially even upgrading the storage to 2 terabytes, that can really help excel your productivity. But if you are gonna be someone who's gonna be mingling around with some graphical work, Photoshop, some illustration, maybe some video editing, that is where the extra 2-core upgrade for the GPU can, definitely help with that. But at the end of the day, if you are looking to get something for editing, the Pro is more your friend. This is something that is more for your everyday task, occasionally editing if you do, want to make some content and whatnot. So here we go. Let's do a quick recap of the pros and the cons. Pros, super lightweight and portable. Next up is the incredibly long battery life. So I mentioned earlier that this thing is, advertised to have up to 18-hour battery life, but with some degradation, I'm probably getting close to like 15 or so. Another pro is that this MacBook Air can pretty much do it all. Like, whatever you want it to do, it can do, with the exception of extremely heavy tasks. I think most people are not gonna have any issues with how this thing performs. The M2 chip is very, very capable. And if you guys seen my base model Mac Mini review with the M2 chip, I showed you guys how capable that machine really is. So if you're looking into a base model M2 Air, watching that video can kind of give you an idea of how it performs, because this one is a little bit upgraded compared to that. So let's talk about the cons of this M2 MacBook Air. First thing being, it only comes in the 13-inch size. I know there is a 15-inch model, but that is only for the M3 and higher. So if you're looking to the M2 generation, 13 inches is all you get. Next thing is the display. So this does not use an OLED display like the Pro models, which is understandable. The only downside is that it only has 500 nits of brightness. So if you are outdoors or in a coffee shop where there's a lot of light, it does seem a little bit dull for the most part. If you're in a dark environment like this, no problem. So that is something to consider. It does kind of reflect a lot. It doesn't have a lot of brightness. So it's more ideal if you are in a controlled environment. Otherwise, it might be a deal breaker for some. And the third thing is a lack of ports. So all you really get on here is the MagSafe charging, 2 USB-C ports, and 1 headphone jack. That's it. So if you are going to be connecting a lot of stuff to it, maybe some hard drives, some accessories, you really only have 2 ports to work with. And oftentimes you'll have to get an adapter to kind of split it and make multiple connections. And the last con that I've mentioned multiple times already is the thermal limitations. So this is subject to overheating and thermal throttling if you are going to be doing any heavy tasks. So with that being said, my conclusion with this M2 MacBook Air is that it's still a really great value. And I would definitely buy a higher spec model compared to a base model M4. Like, sure, the M4 chip on the new one or the M3 chip for 1 generation less is definitely better than an M2. But then you're making sacrifices where you're getting a lower configuration. You get less RAM, less storage on the new model for the base configuration. This configuration that I have on my current MacBook at the time costed me around $2,000. And right now with the depreciation, it's only sitting around $1,000, if not only $900. This thing has heavily depreciated already, and that's why I think it's a great bargain to buy now rather than buying something brand new that is gonna hit depreciation and lose half the value in a few years. With that being said, thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.